The Dam Busters by Paul Brickhill. The day before the war started, Barnes Wallis drove for 5 hours back to Vickers' works at Weybridge, leaving his wife and family in the quiet Dorset Bay where they had pitched tents for a holiday. He had that morning reluctantly decided that war was not only inevitable, but imminent, and he was going to be needed at his drawing board. No point in bringing the family back yet to a house near an aircraft factory till it became clear what influence the Luftwaffe was going to have on one's expectation of life. Wallis didn't look like a man who was going to have much influence on the war himself. He looked more like a diffident and gentle cleric. At 53, his face was unlined and composed, the skin smooth and pink, and the eyes behind the horn-rimmed glasses mild and grey. Crisp white hair like a woolly cap enhanced the effect of benevolence. Most people knew him as a gentle, if rather detached, aircraft designer, and it was not until later that they began to use the word genius. One thought had been haunting him since his decision that war was inevitable. What could he, as an aircraft designer and engineer, do to shorten the conflict? He had been designing for Vickers since before the First World War. In the 20s, he designed the R-100, the most successful British dirigible. In the 30s, he invented the geodetic form of aircraft construction, and using this, designed the Wellesley, which captured the world's non-stop distance record, and the Wellington, which was the mainstay of Bomber Command for the first 3 years of the war. He was now designing the proposed successor to the Wellington, the Warwick. Bombers and bombs were the directions in which he was most qualified to help. Bombs, particularly, seemed a fruitful field. He knew something about RAF bombs, their size, shape, weight, and so on. The knowledge had been essential when he was designing the Wellington, so that it could carry the required bombs over the required distance. It was not knowledge which, in Wallis, inspired complacency. The heaviest bomb was only 500 pounds, and aiming was so unpredictable that the Air Force was forced to indulge in stick bombing. You dropped them one after another in the pious hope that one would hit the target and go off. Too many didn't. Years of placid peace and the diffidence of the Treasury had inhibited the development of bombs, a natural consequence of a war to end all wars, but regrettable in the face of reality. Wallis knew that there had been an attempt in 1926 to make 1,000-pound bombs for the RAF, but they never even got to the testing stage. The Treasury was against them. The Air Staff thought they would never need a bomb larger than 500 pounds, and anyway, Air Force planes were designed to carry 500-pounders. 1,000-pound bombs would need new and costlier planes for the whole Air Force, and the country could not afford it. These shortcomings were not so obvious then, particularly as all air forces favored small bombs designed to attack surface targets. The blast of bigger bombs was curiously local against buildings, and a lot of little bombs seemed better than an equal weight of larger ones. Even larger bombs needed a direct hit to cause much damage, and there was more chance of a direct hit with a lot of little bombs. To Wallis's methodically logical mind, there was a serious flaw in all this. Factories and transport could be dispersed, in fact were dispersed all over Germany. Bombing, vintage 1939, would not damage enough factories to make much difference. He started wondering where and how bombing could hurt Germany most. If one could not hit the dispersed war effort, perhaps there were key points. The sources of Germany's effort, in war or peace, lay in power. Great sources of energy too massive to move or hide. Coal mines, oil dumps and wells, and white coal, hydroelectric power from dams. Without them, there could be no production and no transport, no weapons, no war. But they were too massive to dent by existing bombs. The next step, in theory anyway, was easy. Bigger bombs, much bigger. But that meant bigger aircraft, much bigger than existing ones. All right then, bigger aircraft too. That was the start of it. It sounds simple, but it was against the tenets of the experts of every air force in the world. The war was a few weeks old when the dogged scientist dived into engineering and scientific libraries and started learning about bombs. He studied the chemistry and behavior of high explosives, aerodynamic bomb design, the forging, casting and milling, the theories of light and heavy case bombs, the fusing and the aiming. As the hard winter of 1939 arrived, he progressed to the study of the sources of power. Coal mines. Impossible to collapse the galleries and tunnels hundreds of feet underground. Oil. Romanian oil fields were too far for existing bombers, but a possibility for a future bomber. Germany's synthetic refineries were massive and well defended, perhaps a target for bigger bombs. Dams. 3 German dams stood out: the Mohne, the Eder, and the Sorpe. All in the Ruhr, they accounted for nearly all the water supply to that monstrous arsenal. Wallis knew that the German method needed 8 tons of water to produce a ton of steel. The possibilities were intriguing. The Mohne dammed Mohne Lake, where the Haver flowed into the Ruhr River, maintaining the level so that barges with coal and steel and tanks could go to and from the foundries. Mohne Lake held 134 million tons of water. The Eder dammed the Eder River in Eder Lake, 212 million tons of water. It controlled the level of Germany's second most important waterway, the Mittelland Canal. The Sorpe dammed another tributary of the Ruhr River in Sorpe Lake. The Mohne was 112 feet thick at the base, 130 feet high, and 25 feet thick at the top, where a roadway ran. The Eder was even bigger. Wallis acknowledged that they were formidable. A 500-pound bomb would hardly scratch the concrete. No less formidable was the Sorpe, an earth dam, 2 sloping mounds of earth sealed and buttressed in the center by a core of concrete. Breaches in these dams would send enormous floods ripping down the valleys, tearing away roads, bridges, and railway lines, smashing factories, so that some of them, instead of being deprived of water, would receive somewhat too much. All this was fine, Wallis thought. Logical ideas. But again, one big flaw. The dams were so colossal that bombs 20 times bigger than existing ones were not going to hurt them. His figures showed that when a 1,000-pounder exploded, the charge expanded as a gas bubble, but at the end, the bubble was only 20 feet across. A lot of damage was done beyond this 10-foot radius, however, by flying fragments, by blast, and by the pressure pulse or shock wave. But to be destructive, shock waves had to travel through a more solid medium than air. And somewhere in Wallis's brain, a little cell awoke and stirred restlessly. An old memory, locked up and almost forgotten. It was something he had read, something about concrete. And then it hit him. Waterloo Bridge. Concrete piles being driven into the bed of the Thames. The piles had kept shattering mysteriously, and there had been an investigation. He started searching his bookcases, and in a quarter of an hour had found it. An article in a 1935 journal of the Institution of Civil Engineers. The great drop hammers had been slamming the piles into the riverbed, and the tops of the piles had been exploding upwards. Investigation narrowed the cause to shock waves. The sudden blows sent shock waves shivering down the piles. At the bottom, they met the blunt resistance of the clay and bounced back up the pile at something like 15,000 feet a second, reaching the top just after the hammer had bounced off, so there was nothing to rebound from again, and they passed out and away. And in their wake, you got a tension after the compression, a sort of crush, and then a sharp stretch, almost in the same moment, enough to make a structure split, to shatter it. Concrete, the article concluded sagely, well resisted compression, but poorly withstood tension. Wallis docketed the fact in his mind, thinking of dams. You needed a solid medium to get destructive shock waves. Of course, if you could bury a bomb deep enough. But you couldn't slice a big bomb deep into ferroconcrete. No, but you might be able to inject it deep into some less solid medium before it exploded. You'd get the shock waves then. The expanding gas effects would be greater too. Tamped by the encircling solid, they would have to burst their way out. Now, if you could lock the explosion underground so it could not break out, you would get a sort of seismic disturbance, an earthquake. An earthquake bomb. But how to sink a bomb deeply into a resisting medium? You couldn't put one deep into a concrete dam. But a dam is set in water. Water. It might not transmit a shock wave as well as earth, but it would do so better than air. The tamping effect of water would produce a concentrated explosion and carry the shock punch. He calculated that there was a chance that a 10-ton bomb exploding deep in water by a dam wall would punch out a hole 100 feet across. But he didn't get too excited. No bomber in the world could carry a 10-ton bomb, or for that matter, even a 5-ton bomb far enough to get it to a target. Back to pencil and paper. He knew the limitations of aircraft design in 1940, and in a couple of weeks he knew it was possible to build a 50-ton bomber to carry a 10-ton bomb 4,000 miles at 320 miles an hour and a height of 40,000 feet. He drew up rough specifications and christened it the Victory Bomber. It was a revolutionary and complicated idea, but the Army, Navy, and Air Force were deluged with revolutionary and complicated ideas. The next problem, maybe the biggest, was to get them to listen to this one, to believe and accept it. Wallis spent weeks setting it all out on paper, and took it to people he knew in the RAF and the Ministry of Aircraft Production. It was Dunkirk time. A potent new weapon had never been better timed. Nevertheless, Wallis's paper on the earthquake bomb roused three main emotions in the people who read it: lukewarm interest, incomprehension, and tactful derision. One man understood and did what he could: Arthur Tedder. But he was only an Air Vice Marshal then, and did not have the influence he acquired later as Eisenhower's deputy in the invasion, and then as Lord Tedder, Marshal of the RAF and Chief of the Air Staff. He brought the bomb and the Victory Bomber to the attention of several people in high places, but the only result seemed to be a ubiquitous manifestation of courteous but implacable inactivity. Every machine in the country was working overtime on other vital things, and the ambitious and excellent 4-engine bomber project was just getting underway. It was a fair assumption that it might be disastrous to dislocate that in favor of the Victory bomber, which would inevitably take much longer to develop. That automatically prejudiced the shockwave bomb, because there was therefore no aircraft which could drop it from Wallis's prescribed height of 40,000 feet. The new bombers would probably not be able to lift it, or if they could, to carry it far enough to drop it from higher than 20,000 feet, which was not likely to be enough. But although little seemed to be happening, behind the scenes things were moving in a ponderous government way. Little snippets filtered through to Wallis, particularly from that astute ally, Arthur Tedder. Nothing much, just that so-and-so had consented to look into the idea, and that so-and-so had expressed mild interest. Out of this came one or two more converts. One was Air Commodore Pat Huskinson, Director of Armament Development for the Ministry of Aircraft Production, renowned for his blunt aggressiveness in forcing new weapons through bottlenecks. But most of Huskinson's time was filled with dozens of other problems. And then a bomb fell on his flat. Huskinson lived, but was blinded. Wallis thought the prospects were still favourable. Sir Charles Craven, Managing Director of Vickers, was sympathetic and felt confident enough on November the 1st to write to Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister for Aircraft Production, suggesting he give permission to go ahead on both the 10-ton bomb and the Victory bomber. Then Tedder was posted to take over the RAF in the Middle East, and Wallis had lost his keenest supporter in the sacred and essential precincts of Whitehall. It was soon after that Craven sent for him. "I'm afraid I haven't very encouraging news for you," Craven said as kindly as he could. "Air Council seem too wary of big bombs. They still believe stick bombing is necessary. They say that, from experience, they would rather drop 4 250-pound bombs than one 1,000-pounder, much less a 22,000-pounder. They also say that anyone who thinks of 10-ton bombs is mad." Wallis went back to Weybridge in anger. But in the morning the anger had mostly gone, and in its place was outraged stubbornness. He started writing a treatise on his 10-ton bomb and called it A Note on a Method of Attacking the Axis Powers, the kind of obscure title so favoured by scientists, the word note being particularly misleading, as such things are often as long as a book. Wallis's was. He started by outlining his theory of crippling an enemy by destroying the sources of energy, and went on to discuss in exhaustive detail the physical qualities of the targets: shock waves, blast, penetration, bomb design, aircraft design, aiming problems, possible effects, etc., etc., backed up with pages of graphs and formulae and equations. It was a tour de force, explaining step by step so lucidly that a layman could follow it, if he took the mathematics for granted. The note took Wallis several months, and then he had it roneoed and bound, and posted copies to 70 influential men in science, politics, and the services. Results were not long coming. A Secret Service man called on him with a copy of the note under his arm. "Did you send this to Mr. X?" he asked. "Yes," Wallis said. "Why?" "I'm afraid you shouldn't have done so, Mr. Wallis." "Why?" "It's very secret stuff. This sort of thing must be handled very carefully, and only reach authorized persons. Mr. X was very surprised when this arrived in the post. We were concerned, too." "I sent out 70 of them," Wallis said calmly. The Secret Service man was appalled. 70? To whom? You shouldn't have. It's vital and very secret." "Is it?" said Wallis mildly. "When I showed it to the authorized persons, they said I was mad. I'm supposed to be a crackpot, and this is regarded by authorized persons as fiddle-faddle. The Secret Service man said, "Oh." He asked for the names of the 70. Wallis read them out, and the Secret Service man, who seemed a little uncertain of his ground, went back to London to investigate further. He appeared again a couple of days later. "Well, it's all right," he said. "This time, we've decided that as so many went out so openly, it's actually rather a good form of security. No one will dream it's all so secret. But please don't do it again." The incident was closed. A few days later, there was another result. A copy had reached a Group Captain Winterbottom, who had an office in the city and was used to dealing with unorthodox aspects of the war. He found it convincing, called on Wallis, and Wallis explained more fully. Winterbottom caught some of his enthusiasm. He knew Sir Henry Tizard, who was scientific advisor to the Ministry of Aircraft Production, and drew his special attention to Wallis's paper. Tizard read it carefully. As a scientist, he could follow the intricate calculations. He went down to see Wallis at Weybridge, and was impressed. "I'd better form a committee to study this more fully," he said. "It would have to have pretty solid backing from expert opinion. It would divert effort from other important things if we were to go ahead with it, and we've got to be reasonably sure it would be worthwhile." "Of course," Wallis said. He felt like singing. Not long after, Wallis met the newly formed committee. At the head was Dr. Pye, Director of Scientific Research at the Air Ministry, and the others were scientists too. Wallis explained his ideas and described the probable effect on Germany's war industries if the dams were breached. There was only one really worthwhile time of the year to breach them, and that was in May, when the storage lakes were full after the winter thaw and spring rains, and before the sluice gates were opened to water the country and canals for summer. Then you would get the greatest floods, the most serious loss of water and power. Dr. Pye said the committee would be a few days considering. A week later, Wallis faced the committee to hear their findings. They thought the dams showed possibilities, and the upshot was another committee. This one focused the aim more definitely. It was to be called the Air Attack on Dams Committee. The members were again scientists and engineers, and in a mood to be interested in something new, because even German bombs, though they were more effective than RAF bombs and killed thousands of civilians, had demonstrated the limitation of small bombs. Because aiming was so inaccurate, 75% of such bombs were wasted. With this big bomb, Wallis earnestly impressed on them, you don't have to get a direct hit. I think a 10-ton bomb dropped 50 feet away stands a good chance of knocking a hole in a dam like the Mohne. A near miss like that ought to be simple enough to organize. One of the members, Dr. Glanville of the Road Research Laboratories at Harmondsworth, suggested building a model dam and testing the theories with scaled-down charges of explosive. Wallis accepted delightedly. Over the next few months, whenever he could spare time from his arduous work at Vickers, Wallis helped Glanville design and painstakingly build a model dam 1/50th of the size of the Mohne, with tiny cubes of concrete, scale models of the huge masonry blocks in the real dam. The model was about 30 feet long, 33 inches high, and up to 2 feet thick. A low wall arched between earthen banks, secluded from prying outside eyes in a walled garden. They flooded the ground at one side to simulate the lake, and Wallis exploded a few ounces of gelignite under the surface 4 feet from the model, to give the effect of a 10-tonner going off 200 feet away. There was a commotion on the water, a fountain of mud and water gushed up, and on the model, a couple of patches of concrete flaked and chipped. Not so good, Wallis said. Let's try it closer. He exploded more gelignite 3 feet from the dam, and there was a little more damage. He set off another charge 2 feet away, and still found only minor chipping. At a distance of 12 inches, representing a 10-tonner 50 feet from the dam, the gelignite caused a couple of cracks in the outer structure, but they were small cracks, not enough to harm the dam significantly. They tried several more charges, but the cumulative effect was not encouraging. Glanville built another model, and Wallis tried bigger charges to see what would smash the dam at a distance. One day, a few extra ounces of gelignite a foot away sent a mushroom of water spraying over the wall round the garden, and as the spume cleared, they saw the water of the little lake gushing through the burst dam. Slabs of concrete had cracked and spilled out, and there was the breach that Wallis had been wanting. He calculated the scaled-up charge, which dropped 50 feet away, would smash such a hole in the Mohne. The answer was something like 30,000 pounds of the new explosive RDX. 30,000 pounds was nearly 14 tons. That was the explosive alone. Add the weight of the thick case of special steel, another 40,000 odd pounds. That meant a bomb weighing 70,000 pounds, over 30 tons. And the Victory bomber, still only on paper and straining the limits of feasible aircraft construction, would carry only a 10-tonner. The next meeting of the Air Attack on Dams Committee was in a fortnight, and it required little thought to foresee it would be the last meeting. But Wallis would not give up. Supposing, he thought, a bomb could be exploded against the dam wall. The shockwave punch would be much greater, so the explosive needed would be smaller, and so would the bomb casing. But how to get a big bomb in an exact spot, deep enough for the shock punch and pressed against the wall to make the most of it? Or, as it might require more than one bomb, how could you get them all in the exact spot? The torpedo? But the dams had heavy torpedo netting in front of them, and so torpedoes were out. You could drop a bomb from a very low level for accuracy, but bombs don't simply drop. Just after release, they carry a lot of forward speed, giving them virtually a horizontal trajectory for a while. If you drop a bomb, even a whopper, from very low to get the accuracy, it would simply skid off the water. If you drop it high enough to enter the water cleanly, there is only about 1 chance in 1,000 of putting it right in the exact spot. Wallis probed at this problem for days, and every time he probed, he came slap up against the same old problem. The only way would be to drop something from very, very low and somehow make it go and stay where it was supposed to be. But that seemed impossible. Off and on he puzzled about it, and then one day, out of vague memories, he remembered his last holidays with the children, just before the war began, when they'd been skipping stones across the smooth water of a little pond. How on earth, he thought, could I toss a stone low like that and stop it skipping just where I wanted it? Drop any shape of bomb from low at a couple of 100 miles or more an hour, and Lord knows where it would skip to. When dams are full, there is practically no space between the level of the water and the top of the dam wall. And in his wry imagination, he visualized a series of huge, grotesque bombs bouncing over the dam wall and flying harmlessly downstream. What a pity, he thought idly, that you can't make a torpedo do a bit of bouncing. Over an anti-torpedo net, for instance. But the very shape and operation of a torpedo made that sort of timing virtually impossible. Supposing there were a missile of a different and more tractable shape, something that would skip and then be subject to some form of control or judgment. He began thinking of those pebbles again, and the way they reached the point where they skipped no longer but sank under the water. Wallis went home, dragged a tub into the garden, and filled it to the top with water. Then he rigged up a rubber catapult a few feet away, just a few inches above the level of the water. A few feet on the other side of the tub, he stretched a string between a couple of sticks, so that the string was also just above the level of the water. Logic told him that at some time there would be a point where an object might skip the first few times and then slither to a halt and sink. He borrowed a marble from his daughter Elizabeth and shot it from the catapult at the water. It skipped off the surface and cleared the string by several inches. Elizabeth brought the marble back, and Wallis fired it again, this time with a little less tension on the rubber of the catapult. The marble slipped off the water and only just cleared the string. "Aha," thought Wallis, "it can be controlled." He and the youngsters spent the whole morning playing with the marbles on the water and the catapult and the string, trying different combinations of power and height, while Wallis was finding out how much he could control the skip. To his deep joy, he found that with a regular shape and weight like a marble, on smooth water, he could control it well enough for it to be distinctly encouraging. The day of the meeting of the Air Attack on Dams Committee, he went early to London, buttonholed the chairman, Dr. Pye, and privately explained his new theory, so earnestly that Pye didn't laugh, though he looked a little sideways. "I'd rather you didn't tell the others yet," Wallis said. "They might think it a bit far-fetched." "Yes," said Dr. Pye. "I see that. What do you want me to do?" "Give me time to find out how much RDX will blow a hole in the Mohne Dam if it's pressed up against the wall." Pye talked eloquently to the committee without giving Wallis's secret away. The members were reluctant when they heard the results of the last model's test, and Wallis was like a cat on hot bricks, till they consented to one more experiment. Glanville built him a new model dam, and Wallis started with small charges, sinking them in the water and exploding them when they were lying against the slabs of concrete. The effects were shattering, literally. He smashed wall after wall, seeking the smallest charge needed, and soon he knew that in a contact explosion tamped by water, a tiny plug of a few ounces of gelignite blasted a satisfying hole through a concrete wall 6 inches thick. From that, he calculated, he would need only 6,000 pounds of RDX to breach the Mohne Dam. With this new idea, he could cut the case weight down to a little over 3,000 pounds, making the complete bomb about 9,500 pounds. Less than 5 tons. The new 4-engined Lancasters would carry that to the Ruhr without trouble. Armed with sums and theories, Wallis faced the task of convincing officials in their brick and stone lairs along Whitehall and other influential thoroughfares that he could put his bomb in the exact spot. An awkward task because they were all allergic to weird inventions. He called on Professor Patrick Blackett, director of an operational research branch, and Blackett, a spare, rather intense man, listened to his ideas, carefully examined the calculations, riffled them back into a neat pile, and said quietly, "We've been looking for this for 2 years." Wallis was electrified. "I'd like you to leave these with me for a while. Blackett said. "There are one or two people I know who would be interested." Blackett moved fast. As soon as Wallis had left, he went to see Sir Henry Tizard and told him what he had heard. Tizard also moved with unorthodox haste, driving down to Weybridge next morning, where Wallis eagerly explained it all again. "It seems," Tizard said when he'd finished, "that the main thing to establish is whether this freak of yours will really work, and if so, how we go about putting it into practice." At Teddington, he said, was a huge ship testing tank, which would be ideal for experiments. He also thought there should be more tests to check how much explosive would theoretically punch a hole in the dam. "I think I know just the thing," said Wallis, whose damology researches had been fanatical. "There's a small disused dam in Radnorshire. No earthly use anymore as a dam, and won't ever be. We could try and knock it down." "Who owns it?" Tizard asked. "Birmingham Corporation." Wallis knew all the answers. "Oh, we'll try them," Tizard said. And Birmingham Corporation, with a little prodding, said yes. It was a nice little dam, about 150 feet long and quite thick, curving gracefully across the mouth of a reach of Eder Lake, high in the Welsh hills west of Leominster. Wallis estimated that the dam should have a fifth of the resistance of the Mohne, an ideal test model. He calculated the smallest charge that should knock it down, and set off with a packet of RDX and some explosives engineers. Wrapped against the raw mountain wind, he wasted little time, measured out the charge, tamped it in a sealed casing, and lowered it deep into the water against the dam wall. Behind the rocks, his mouth dry with anxiety, he pressed the plunger, and the hills echoed with sound. Water spurted 100 feet high. The lake whipped into fury, and as the water plunged back into the void, the concrete crumbled, and a hissing flood burst into the main lake. Wallis, pink with glee, saw there was a ragged hole in the dam 15 feet across and about 12 feet deep. For the next 5 months he experimented whenever he could in the ship tank at Teddington, an enormous thing hundreds of feet long. He wanted to find out exactly how to control a skipping missile so that after a given number of bounces over a given distance, he could make it reach a certain given point at a particular speed and height. At this ultimate point, the missile would have to be either slithering across the water or only moving slowly, just a fraction above it. He had to find out the best combinations of weight of missile and height, speed and power of release. Using an adjustable spring-loaded catapult so that he could measure the force behind it, he started firing marbles at first. Wallis realized that a missile of regular shape, such as a sphere, was needed so that no matter how it might flick or spin after the first impact, it would still hit the water with an identical shape on the next and subsequent bounces. But soon he noticed something inconsistent about the bouncing marbles. More often than not, they tended to dig in and sink after the third bounce, or thereabouts. Maybe it was the small size of the marbles that made them unstable. Maybe some imperceptible ripple on the water affected them. The only consistent pattern was that they never bounced as far as the far end of the tank, except for one or two strong shots that hit the end and always bounced back too far. There would obviously be ripples on the lake's surface, held back by the dams. Something bigger and heavier might not be so affected. He tried using golf balls, but they were as unpredictable as the marbles. Then he tried using 2-pound spheres of steel, but they were no better either. It was on a Sunday afternoon that he found what seemed to be the answer. It seems so simple, really. The first bounce gave the marble a pronounced topspin, and that was why they tended to dig themselves into the water. Of course, one could try a flattish shape like a disc-type stone, but heaven knows how one could control the skips. There was one other answer. Just one. The spherical projectiles must be fired with a pronounced backspin. Wallace rigged up a cradle for the spring-loaded catapult that allowed him to spin the missile backwards just before release. He got a double bonus. For one thing, virtually every shot hit or slithered against the far end of the tank. And even more important, the residual backspin still on the small projectile made it crawl under the water at the far end, flat against the far wall of the tank. It was exactly what he wanted to happen when the missiles reached the dam wall. Now another problem cropped up. Wallace had been calculating the size of a sphere that would carry enough RDX explosive inside a steel case strong enough to stand the impact of hitting both the water and the dam wall. Hitting water at something well over 200 miles an hour would be like hitting concrete. He started to work out the required diameter of the sphere. He already knew that he would have to take both bomb bay doors off the Lancasters and suspend the bombs under the belly with legs that stuck down underneath with some sort of belt or chain drive from some power source to get them spinning backwards before the drop. Finding the necessary size of the sphere wasn't difficult. He soon worked it out. And damn! The sphere was going to be too big. It had to be slung close to the center of gravity of the aircraft and low enough to clear the tunnel of the fuselage above. But if he slung it low enough for that, the base of the missile was going to be crushed hard against the ground. In fact, you could only load the missile in place by jacking the aircraft up till the undercarriage wheels were clear of the tarmac. Once you took the jacks away, either the legs would buckle and the missile burst through the fuselage floor, or the aircraft would break its back, or both. You couldn't sufficiently lift the fuselage floor of a Lancaster or other suitable aircraft because the space around the center of gravity was already overcrammed with immovable main spar, crew, and equipment. Any way you looked at it, neither aircraft nor missile would be getting off the ground. It was pointless making the sphere smaller. That would either weaken the casing too much or cut down the explosive contents too much. So even if you got it loaded, it couldn't be anything more than a study in still life until you took the jacks away. Then the scrap metal wouldn't be funny. He could not pinpoint the exact moment he began thinking about gyroscopic principles. If you make something spin fast enough around an axis, it needs a surprising amount of force to tilt it off that axis. The Earth is one example of spinning on an axis. It stays on that same axis, but it doesn't have to be a sphere. Wallis knew that he had to reduce the diameter of his missile, and he knew it still had to hit the water on every bounce with the same shape surface as before. He already knew his missile had to drop with a lot of backspin on it to control the bounces, and also to make it crawl underwater flat against the dam wall when it hit. So why not a missile shaped like a portly barrel with enough backspin to keep it gyroscopically on an identical axis all the way? That would reduce the diameter without lengthening the barrel shape too much. His assistants carved on lathes a series of fat, barrel-shaped models, each with differing weight-size shape ratios, and all of them with a potential diameter small enough to be carried under a Lancaster. Wallis tested each repeatedly with varying combinations of backspin, catapult velocity, and height. Consistently, they skipped across the water in the tank in little flashes of spray, but seldom tilting off their horizontal axis, presenting at each skip the same pot-bellied shape to the water. By trial and error, he found at what speeds each model would slither against the far end of the tank and crawl under the water, hugging the wall. By simple elimination, he was able to choose the model with the widest range of reliable performance. The rest was largely doing sums, such as how fast a 5-ton barrel could be safely spun backwards before release from an aircraft and achieve enough gyroscopic stability for half a mile or more of bouncing bumps. Wallis made it between 450 and 500 revolutions per minute backwards. By the middle of 1942, Wallis was satisfied he could make a 5-tonner do what he wanted it to. Tizard was pleased, but Tizard was an advisor, not all-powerful. The task was to get executive officials keen. Wallis saw several officials, received tea and courtesy, even compliments, but not enough action to please him. Then one day the phone rang, and a man named Lane, speaking from London, said he wanted to talk to Wallis about a secret matter. He was, he said, from one of the committees dealing with new and secret weapons. Wallis felt his heart skip. What's it about, he asked. It's to do with aircraft and water, said the man. But I mustn't say any more over the phone. Can I come and see you? Tomorrow, said Wallis, as early as you like. Lane walked into his office in the morning, an alert young man, and Wallis welcomed him warmly. Lane said, "Do you remember an idea of yours back in 1941 about putting a smoke screen around a fleet?" "Yes," said Wallis, "I remember." "Well, we're interested in it now," Lane said. "Have been for some time, but we couldn't do everything at once. Can you tell me a little bit more about it?" Wallis spent the next hour going into detail, and when he'd finished, and Lane was thanking him and rising to go, he said a little wistfully, "You know, it's very disappointing. I thought you wanted to see me about my pet idea that nobody seems to want." "Oh?" said Lane politely, reaching for his hat. "What's that?" Wallis started to tell him, and as he described his tests, the casual attention on Lane's face changed to a look of startled interest. He sat down again and listened for another hour. Afterwards, when he rose to go again, he said, "I'll tell my chief about this one. I think he might be interested." Lane's chief rang Wallis next morning, and an hour later he was in Wallis's office. Hours later he went back to London as nearly convinced as a man can be by figures. He spent just under 48 hours chewing it over, then he picked up the phone and called Wallis again. "I thought you might like to know," he said, "that I've made arrangements for you to go ahead and make 6 half-size prototypes of your bomb thing. You can convert a Wellington to test drop them, and we'll both keep our fingers crossed. Purely for experiment, you know." It took a few seconds for it to sink in, before Wallis could express his fervent thanks. Converting a Wellington was simple enough. Wallis had the bomb doors taken off a production model. 2 sturdy steel struts were bolted in their place so that they hung down like stiff, short little legs. Each had a bearing gear at the base so that a bomb could be slung between them with freedom to revolve. One bearing had a sprocket attachment for chain drive, and twin quick-release shackles were no problem. Wallace looked for a compact, lightweight motor to rotate the bomb and soon found what he wanted. An electric motor salvaged from the gizzards of an obsolete Vickers submarine broken up in some marine yard. He mounted this in the fuselage of the Wellington. Rigging the chain drive and switches was no trouble. By this time, the castings of the 6 half-size, 2.5-ton prototype bombs were finished and balanced, then filled with a harmless substitute, the same weight as RDX. At 3 p.m. on December the 4th, 1942, the converted Wellington took off from Weybridge with the first bomb slung below and Mutt Summers, chief test pilot for Vickers, in the pilot's seat. Wallis, hopeful butterflies fluttering in his stomach, crouched in the nose as bomb aimer to test drop off Chesil Beach on the south coast. They were not going to worry much this time about precise speed and height, about 200 feet and 200 miles per hour, and for the time being, never mind exactly how far the bomb went. The main thing was to see whether a couple of tons of spinning steel would bounce according to theory. Wallis was lying on his stomach in the nose, looking through the bomb aimer's perspex floor panel for a clear stretch of Chesil Beach water. He sighted one, and briefly, over the intercom, guided Summers towards it. As Summers wheeled and then started a shallow dive, Wallis switched on the electric motor just in front of him. It started to whine louder and louder, and as its speed increased, Wallis could feel the growing vibration through the aircraft as the bomb spun backwards, faster and faster, towards the 8 revs a second mark. Coming up to the clear water, Summers leveled out fairly low and reported briefly, "Speed 220 indicated." "Right. Now." Wallis pressed the button and watched the spinning black thing slip clear of its stowage. It took so long to drop that it seemed like slow motion, as its forward trajectory kept it still under the aircraft, but slowly losing speed and falling behind. Then, quite suddenly, it hit, and vanished in a sheet of hissing white spray. Wallis watched with painful anxiety for it to appear. Just for a moment, nothing seemed to happen, and then, out of the foam, lurched the black thing, looking vaguely misshapen in its aura of spray. It fell back into the water quite quickly, lurched drunkenly up again, hit once more, skipped another short distance, then slithered a few yards and vanished into the green depths. It didn't seem to have traveled more than about 200 yards, and Wallis looked down, puzzled, not quite knowing what to think. It had worked, but not the way it was supposed to. Something was wrong. Summers turned the aeroplane back towards Weybridge, and Wallis, on the way back, trying to imagine what could have gone wrong, remembered the misshapen look about the bomb. He decided the casing had not been strong enough. It must have crushed a little under the impact, making the bounces unpredictable and sluggish. When they landed, he ordered the cases of the remaining bombs strengthened. On December the 12th, he and Summers took off with a strengthened bomb. Off Chesil Beach, Wallis watched the bomb going down, holding his breath and feeling his mouth dry with anxiety. Again, the hissing sheet of spray as it hit, and then out of the spray, the black barrel came soaring 100 yards across the water, hit with another flashing feather of spray, and soared out again, hit again and again, the distances shortening every time until at last, after nearly half a mile, it slithered to a foaming stop and sank. Summers had banked the aeroplane round. They both looked down on that glorious sight of the long necklace of white foaming scars on the water where the bomb had hit. Wallis had never known such a moment of triumph. He crawled halfway out of the nose to look up and grin at Summers above in the cockpit. The engines were making too much noise to talk, but Summers grinned down at him, gave him the thumbs-up sign and an enormous wink. In the next 3 days, he and Summers dropped 3 more bombs, and they worked every time. After that, things happened very quickly. From somewhere on high, Wallis got instructions to try the prototype bomb in a small Mosquito bomber against a battleship moored in a remote naval station. This time the aircraft was faster, and the bomb bounced further till it hit the side of the battleship, virtually amidships, and crawled below under the hull. They made several runs, and the results were similar in every case. These subsequent runs were filmed by an aircraft flying alongside and following the track of the bouncing bomb. Next, an urgent summons to the Admiralty, together with his films, and there he found the First Sea Lord, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound, a gaggle of other admirals, and the Chief of the Air Staff, Marshal of the RAF, Lord Portal. In a private cinema, the films were run through of the missile hitting the battleship, and a startled murmuring burst forth. It's unlikely that anyone will ever know the precise story of the intrigue that went on behind the scenes in the next couple of days. In the end, it was Churchill himself who made the decision to get the dam's project moving. He issued instructions to go ahead with the preliminary design of a full-size bomb, and Wallis felt the fierce joy of a front row forward who was heaved manfully in the scrum and gained a couple of inches. This was early February 1943, and the best time to smash the dams was in May, when they were full. To leave it later might annoy the Germans, but not seriously incommode them. On February the 26th, Wallis received a message. Mr. Wallis, orders have been received. The Jaw Dams project is to go ahead immediately, with a view to an operation at all costs, no later than May. It took some time for Wallis to take it in. After battling for so long, Wallis, in the weeks that followed, sometimes ruefully thought that he'd got more action than he could stand. Life was work from dawn till midnight, planning, drafting, thinking and discussing, grabbing a sandwich with one hand while the work went on. The shape of the large bombs, known by the code name of upkeep, took a lot of devising. The central core holding the explosive was to be in the form of a cylindrical steel barrel nearly 7 feet long. To fit around that, Wallis had squads of men carving thick staves like the outside of a barrel, which were to be clamped around the cylinder with very strong bands of high tensile steel to form his required elongated barrel shape. And then each bomb, as it was completed, had to be balanced so that no single arc was heavier than the others. If one of the bombs had a little throw on one segment, the whole cumbersome weapon, revolving at nearly 500 RPM, would tear it out of its cradle and possibly tear the aircraft apart too. Apart from these demanding details, one of the first things Wallis himself had to do was calculate as closely as possible the speed, height, and distance from the dam that the bomb should be released. No good having them bounce over the top or hit the dam wall so hard that the bomb broke open and defused itself, or worse, blew up and wrecked the aircraft without denting the dam. It was a complex three-way equation, made more difficult by his awareness that pilots were not going to find it easy to fly the precise limits, especially at night. He already knew it had to be by night. No Lancaster would ever reach the low-level targets by day. The pilot precision problem was beginning to bother him, and it bothered him still more when he worked out the equation. A speed of 240 miles an hour at 150 feet above the water and 800 yards from the dam wall. The speed was no trouble, but the height at night was perilously low, and the range of 800 yards might be awkward too. He had an uncomfortable feeling that he had concentrated too much on bomb performance and not enough on the human and flight element. Roy Chadwick, chief Avro designer, fairly soon got the first modified Lancaster converted with the two heavy caliper struts sticking down each side of the fuselage like legs, and part of the fuselage above cut away to allow for rotation. He had this aircraft test flown with one of the first bombs rotating at nearly 500 revs per minute for 5 minutes, and there was no hint of trouble. When the time came, the bombs would not have to be rotated for more than a couple of minutes before release. Over Germany, every day a fast mosquito flew 25,000 feet over the dams taking photographs. Deep in the underground vaults of Bomber Command, men studied the photographs through thick magnifying glasses to check the level of the rising water and the defenses. If the secret leaked out, they would see the extra flak, and the raid would have to be called off. It was going to be suicidal enough as it was. There seemed to be at least 6 gun positions around the Mohne alone, and that was no matter for comfort because the bombs would have to be dropped from very low level, so low that a pilot could lean out and almost dangle his fingers in the water. They would have to fly between 2 towers on the top of the dam, and some of the guns were in these towers. At his headquarters, Sir Arthur Harris, Chief of Bomber Command, was spending a lot of time pondering how the attack should be made, and who should make it. On March the 15th, he sent for Air Vice Marshal the Honourable Ralph Cochrane, who, 2 days before, had become Air Officer commanding No. 5 Bomber Group. "I've got a job for you, Cocky," Harris said, and told him about Wallis's weird bomb and what he proposed to do with it. At the end, he said, "I know it sounds far-fetched, but I think it has a good chance. I want you to organize the raid. What I have in mind is a new squadron of experienced people who are just finishing a tour. Some of the keen chaps won't mind doing another trip. Can you find enough in your group?" "Yes, sir." Cochrane asked Harris if he wanted anyone in particular to command the new squadron, and Harris said, "Yes, Gibson." Cochrane nodded in satisfaction, and 10 minutes later, deep in thought, he was driving back to the old Victorian mansion outside Grantham that was 5 Group headquarters. There could probably have been no better choice than Cochrane for planning the raid. A spare man with a lean face, his manner was crisp and decisive, perfectly reflecting his mind. He had perhaps the most incisive brain in the RAF. His god was efficiency, and he sought it uncompromisingly. Moreover, Cochrane knew Wallis well, had worked with him in the Royal Naval Air Service in World War I, flying his experimental airships and testing the world's first airship mooring mast, which Wallis had designed. Ever since then, Cochrane had had a quick sympathy for the scientific approach. That night, a nuggety little man with a square, handsome face took off on the last trip of his 3rd tour. This was Guy Gibson. If he got back, he was due for leave and a rest, having been on ops almost constantly since the war started. The target was Stuttgart, and it was Gibson's 173rd trip. He was a wing commander with the DSO and DFC. He was 25 years old. The next morning, Gibson woke late, head still ringing with the engine noise, and lay curled up, half thinking, half dreaming of leave in Cornwall. That morning his leave was cancelled, and to his dismay he was posted to 5 Group headquarters. A day or so later, he was shown into Cochrane's office and saluted smartly. "Ah, Gibson," Cochrane said. "Firstly, my congratulations on the bar to your DSO." "Thank you, sir." "Would you like to do one more trip?" Gibson gulped and said a little warily, "What kind of trip, sir?" "An important one. I can't tell you any more about it now, except that you would command the operation." Gibson said slowly, "Yes, I think so, sir," thinking of the flak and the fighters he hoped he had finished with for a time. "Good, that's fine. I'll let you know more as soon as I can." A moment later, Gibson was outside the door, wondering what it was all about. He waited 2 days before Cochrane sent for him again, and this time another man was with him, Group Captain Charles Whitworth, who commanded the bomber base at Scampton, a stocky, curly-haired man of about 30, with a long list of operations behind him and a DSO and DFC on his tunic. Cochrane was friendly. Sit down, he said. I asked you the other day if you'd care to do another raid, and you said you would. But I want to warn you that this will be no ordinary sortie, and it can't be done for at least 2 months. Training for this raid is so important that the Commander-in-Chief wants a special squadron formed. I want you to form it. Gibson said nothing, and Cochrane went on. You'd better use Whitworth's main base at Scampton. As far as aircrews are concerned, you'll want good ones. You'd better pick them yourself. I'm telling all the squadrons they'll have to give up some of their best crews. There's a lot of urgency in this because you haven't got very long, and training is going to be very important. What sort of training, sir? Gibson asked. And what sort of target? Low flying, Cochrane said. You've got to be able to low fly at night till it's second nature. I can't tell you the target yet, that's a secret. But you've all got to be perfect at low flying, at night. How about aircraft, sir? The equipment staff have that in hand. The first will be flown in tomorrow. And one thing more. You'll have to watch security. As far as others are concerned, this is just an ordinary new squadron. We'll think up a cover plan later. Somewhat bewildered, Gibson went off to the SOA to see how one went about forming a new squadron. And half an hour later, he was looking at a long list of things he had to do and people he had to see. A staff officer helped him to pick air crew from the group lists. Gibson knew most of the pilots. He got the staff man to help him pick the navigators, engineers, bomb aimers, wireless operators, and gunners. When they'd finished, he had 147 names, 21 complete crews, 7 to a crew. Gibson had his own crew. They were just finishing their tour too, but they all wanted to come with him. The equipment officer promised to deliver 10 Lancasters to Scampton within 2 days, just for a start. More would follow. With them would come the spare spark plugs and tools, starter motors and drip trays, bomb dollies and winches, paint and chocks and thermos flasks. Gibson was startled by the unending list. Another man promised the 1,001 items for the men. Blankets and lorries and bootlaces, beer and socks, and so on. He was 2 days on these details, helped by Cochrane's deputy, the SASO, Group Captain Harry Satterley. And then it was all done, except for one thing. What squadron are you? Asked Satterley. What do you mean, sir? Oh, what number? You've got to have a number. Oh, said Gibson, where do I get that? Oh, somewhere in the Air Ministry, Satterley said. I'll get onto them and fix it up. Meantime, you better call yourselves X Squadron. Just before dinner on March the 21st, Gibson arrived at Scampton to take formal command. In the officers' mess, he found some of his crews already arrived, and the mess waiters looking curiously at them as they stood around with pints of beer in their fists. It was obvious they were not to be an ordinary squadron. The average age was about 22, but they were clearly veterans. DFC ribbons were everywhere. They'd all done at least one tour, and some had done 2. Gibson moved among them, followed by the faithful Nigger, his big black Labrador dog, who rarely left his heels. Someone laid a half-pint of beer on the floor for Nigger, who stuck his muzzle noisily into it and didn't look up again till he'd licked it dry. From his old 106 squadron, Gibson had brought 3 crews as well as his own, those of Hopgood, Shannon, and Burpee. Hopgood was English, fair and good-looking except for a long front tooth that stuck out at an angle. Dave Shannon, DFC, was a baby-faced 20-year-old from Australia, but didn't look any more than 16, so he was growing a large moustache to look older. Gibson spotted Mickey Martin with satisfaction. They had met at Buckingham Palace when Gibson was getting his DSO and the King was pinning on the first of Martin's DFCs. Though he came from Sydney, Martin was in the RAF. He was slight but good-looking, with a wild glint in his eyes and a monstrous moustache that ended raggedly out by his ears. At the palace they had talked shop, and Martin had explained his low-flying system. He'd worked it out that if you flew lower than most bombers, you'd avoid the fighters. Lower still, and the heavy flak would all burst well above. And if you got right down to tree-top height, you'd be gone before the light flak could draw a bead on you. There was still the risk of balloons, but Martin reasoned that there would not be any balloons along the main roads or railways, so he followed those. He had had the same gunners for 2 years, Toby Foxley and Tammy Simpson, both fellow Australians, and on their low-level junkets they'd become expert at picking off searchlights. Simpson and Foxley had both come with him. He'd also brought an experienced navigator, a lean, long-chinned Australian called Jack Lego, and his bomb-aimer, Bob Hay, also Australian. Lego was to be the navigation officer of the new squadron, and Hay was to be the bombing leader. It is unlikely that there was a finer crew in bomber command, hence Gibson's pleasure. He had chosen Dingy Young as his senior flight commander. Young had already ditched twice in his 2 tours, and both times got back home in his rubber dinghy. Bred in California, educated at Cambridge, he was a large, calm man whose favourite trick was to swallow a pint of beer without drawing breath. Les Munro was a New Zealander, tall, blue-chinned and solemn, a little older than the others. He was standing by the bar looking into space when Gibson located him. "Glad to see you, Les," Gibson said. "I see you're setting a good example already, drinking a little and thinking a lot." Munro upended his pint and drained it. "No, sir," he said. "Thinking a little and drinking a lot." The other flight commander was Henry Maudsley, ex-50 Squadron. Ex-Eton, an athlete, polished and quiet, not a heavy drinker. Towering above the rest was the blonde head of a man who weighed nearly 15 stone, with a pink face and pale blue eyes, good-looking in a rugged way. Joe McCarthy from Brooklyn, USA, former lifeguard at Coney Island, had joined the RAF before America came into the war. No one knew what they were there for, but looking at the men around them, realized something special was in the wind. Someone finally asked Gibson what the form was, and Gibson simply said, "I know less than you, old boy, but I'll see you all in the morning to give you what gen I can." In the morning, Gibson called all the crews to the long briefing room on top of station headquarters and said, "I know you're wondering why you're here. Well, you're here as a crack squadron to do a special job which I'm told will have startling results and may shorten the war. I can't tell you what the target is or where it is. All I can tell you is you'll have to practice low flying day and night until you can do it with your eyes shut. If I tell you to fly to a tree in the middle of England, I want you to be able to do it. If I tell you to fly through a hangar that isn't wide enough for your wingtips, I want you to have a go at that too. You've got to be able to do anything you're told, without question." There was a breathless silence. "Discipline is going to be essential. So is security. You're going to be talked about. It's unusual to have a crowd like you forming a squadron. Your lives really depend on secrecy. If we can surprise them, everything will be fine. And if they're ready for us..." He looked at them in silence. When he walked into the mess bar just before dinner, Charles Whitworth buttonholed him. "Well, Gibby," he said, "you're going to command 617 Squadron." Gibson looked thunderstruck. 617, he said. "But I thought... Who and where the hell are they?" "Here," said Whitworth peaceably. Your new number. Someone in the air house has moved off his bottom. Your squadron marking letters are AJ. Humphreys, the new adjutant, arrived next afternoon. A little fair-haired man, only 28, he was keen on flying, but his eyes had stopped him. Gibson told Humphreys as much as he knew himself, and as Humphreys was leaving his office, Gibson said, "I don't know yet what it's all about, but I gather this squadron will either make history or be wiped out." Humphreys looked at him, not knowing whether he was joking. In the morning, the curtain lifted a little. Gibson got a call from Satterley, who told him to catch a certain train to Weybridge, where he would be met at the station. "May I know who I'm meeting, sir?" "He'll know you," Satterley said. Gibson walked out of Weybridge station at 2:30, and a big man squeezed behind the wheel of a tiny Fiat said, "Hello, Guy." "Mutt," Gibson said, surprised. "Are you the man I'm looking for?" "Well, if you're the man I'm waiting for, I am," Summers said. "Jump in." They drove down the winding, tree-lined road that leads to Vickers and went past the main gates without turning in. "What's this all about, Mutt?" Gibson said, unable to hold back any longer. He had first met Summers back in 1935, when he was 18. He had wanted to fly, so he'd got an introduction to Summers at Vickers and asked about becoming a Vickers test pilot. "Go and join the Air Force and learn to fly first," Summers had advised. "You'll be doing some testing soon," Summers said. "Not for me exactly, but quite a test." He turned in some double gates and they pulled up outside the house at Burr Hill. Summers led the way into a room with windows looking over the golf course, and a white-haired man got up from the desk. "I'm glad you've come," Wallis said. "Now we can get down to it. There isn't a great deal of time left. I don't suppose you know much about the weapon." "Weapon?" Gibson said. "I don't know anything about anything. Group Captain Satterley said you'd tell me everything." Wallis blinked. "Well, don't you even know the target?" "Not the faintest idea." "Oh, my dear boy," Wallis said in a sighing and faintly horrified voice. He wandered over to the window and looked out, pondering. "This makes it very awkward. I'll tell you as much as I dare, and hope the AOC will tell you the rest when you get back. There are certain objects in enemy territory which are very big and quite vital to his war effort. They're so big that ordinary bombs won't hurt them, but I got an idea for a special type of big bomb." He told Gibson about the shock waves and his weird idea for dropping bombs exactly in the right spot. Gibson looked slightly baffled. "Come along and I'll show you," Wallis said, and he led Gibson into a tiny projection room. Wallis thumbed the switches, and a flickering screen lit up with the title, "Most Secret Trial Number 1. A Wellington dived into view over water, and what looked like a black barrel fell from it, seemed to drop slowly, and then was hidden in spray as it hit. Gibson started in amazement as out of the spray the black thing shot, bounced 100 yards, bounced again in a cloud of spray, and went on bouncing for what seemed an incredibly long time before it vanished. He was still staring at the screen when the lights went up again, and he heard Wallis's voice. "Well, that's my secret bomb," Wallis said. "That's how you're going to put it in the right place." "Over water?" Gibson said, fishing for a clue. Yes," said Wallis, avoiding the subject of the target. "Over water at night or in the early morning when it's very flat. And maybe there'll be fog. Now, can you fly to the limits I want? Roughly a speed of 240 miles per hour at 150 feet above smooth water and be able to bomb accurately?" "Well, it's terribly hard to judge height over water," Gibson said, "especially at night. Not too bad in the moonlight if there's a chop on the water, a few white horses. But smooth water? He wrinkled his brow. A bit dicey. It's like a mirror. How much margin of error? Very little, I'm afraid. Almost none. Otherwise... Wallis hesitated, frustrated by security. It's got to reach the right spot at the right speed and the right height. 150 feet. If one of the factors is wrong, the sum doesn't add up. Well, Gibson was thinking about echo altimeters, bouncing an electric signal down and back off the water again, but decided, correctly, that they wouldn't be fast or sensitive enough. He said hopefully, well, we can try a couple of things. Well, I suppose we can find some way. He sounded a little dubious, and Wallis sighed. I hope so, he said. There isn't much time, and there's an awful lot to do. Back at Scampton, Gibson found some Lancasters had arrived, and ground crews were checking them over. In the morning, he told his senior men what height they would have to bomb at, but nothing about the bomb itself. Bill Astle, Deputy A Flight Commander, took off the first Lancaster and was away 5 hours, coming back with photographs of lakes all over the North Country. Gibson laid out 10 separate routes for the crews to practice over, and in the days that followed, the Lancasters were nosing thunderously into the air all day and cruising at 100 feet over the flat fens of Lincolnshire, Suffolk, and Norfolk. After a few days, they came down to 50 feet and flew longer routes, stretching out to the North Country, threading through the valleys of the Pennines, climbing and diving over the Welsh mountains, then down to Cornwall and up to Scotland, eventually as far as the Hebrides. Gibson took his own Lancaster, G for George, and flew over to a lake in the Pennines to test the business of flying accurately at 150 feet above water. Diving over the hills, he throttled back and flattened out just over the lake, but it took him time, busily juggling control column, trimmers, and throttles to get the needle fairly steady within a few feet of the 150-foot mark. He just had time to note that the speed was still too high when the hills at the far end loomed ahead, and he had to ease the stick back quickly and slam on throttle. G for George lifted noisily and cleared the crest with an adequate margin, but not a generous one. Gibson's chunky bomb-aimer, Spam Spafford, had a front row view in the nose and said conversationally over the intercom, "That was interesting, Skipper. About 50 feet, I'd say." They tried it several times more, and Gibson was getting his approach drill into a fairly consistent groove. Not spot on, but not far off. It was promising, but only in a limited way. Over Germany, barometric pressures would be unpredictable, and Gibson knew he still had to be able to do it at night without relying too much on the altimeter. They tried it again at dusk that evening, with fog drifting over the lake. Spafford couldn't see the hills, and Gibson couldn't see the water, until on the second run, cutting the corners a bit, he hit a slight downdraft. He reacted fast, but they near as damn it went in. He heard a grunt over the intercom as Trevor Roper in the rear turret saw ripples on the water from the slipstream. Even Spafford was shaken. He'd had a brief close-up of the looming water from the nose perspex, and as Gibson hauled her up, Spafford muttered for all to hear, "This is bloody dangerous." The only one not perturbed was Nigger, who often flew with Gibson, though not on ops, and went everywhere with him on the ground. Gibson flew back and told Cochrane that if he couldn't find some way of judging height accurately, there'd be no chance of doing the raid. "Well, there's still time to worry about that," Cochrane said. "Just now I want you to have a look at models of your targets." He waved a hand at 3 packing cases in a corner of his office. Gibson eyed them curiously. "You can't train your men properly unless you know what they are, so I'm letting you know now, but you'll be the only man in the squadron to know. Keep it that way." A corporal brought in a hammer, and Cochrane sent him out of the room while Gibson gently prized the lids loose and lifted the battens. It took him a couple of seconds to realize they were dams. One was the Mohne, and the other two were the Eder and the Sorpe. Handsome models that showed not only the dams but the countryside in detail for miles around, as though photographs had been taken on a third dimension. Gibson stood looking for a long time, and then Cochrane laid the lids back over them. "Now you've seen what you're going to attack," he said. "Go and see Wallis again, and come and see me when you get back." The first thing Wallis said, eagerly, was, "How did you get on?" "Only fair by day," Gibson said, "but pretty awful at night. In fact, flying level at night over water at 150 feet seems plain impossible." Wallis looked anxious. "Well, we still have some time to work out some way of doing it," he said. "We have to. Now, I'll tell you more about this Downwood business." "Downwood?" said Gibson. "The code name for the raid." Wallis explained how the bombs were to explode deep against the dam walls. "I've calculated that the first one ought at least to crack them, and then more bombs in the same place should shift the cracked wall back till it topples over, helped, of course, by the water pressure. The best times, of course, are when the dams are full. That'll be in May. You'll need moonlight, and there's a full moon from the 13th to the 19th of May. About 6 weeks from now. Yes. You've got to be accurate, or you might overshoot, and the bomb will hit the parapet and go off there. That won't hurt the dam." "Hurt us, though," Gibson said as it dawned on him. "The aircraft would be just above it." "Yeah, it would." Gibson went back thoughtfully to Scampton. The crews were now getting good at low night cross-countries and extended their trips out over the North Sea. They practiced low-level bombing on the range at Wainfleet, diving over the sand, dropping 11.5-pound practice bombs with the low-level bomb sight. The drops were not nearly accurate enough. Gibson took the problem to Cochrane. 2 days later, a Wing Commander Dan from the Ministry of Aircraft Production called on Gibson. "I hear you're having bomb sight trouble for the dams raid." "How the hell do you know about that?" Gibson said. "I've been let into it," said Dan, "because I'm supposed to be a sighting expert. I think I can solve your problems. You may have noticed there are a couple of towers on top of each dam wall. We've measured them from the air, and they're 600 feet apart. Now, this is how we do it." It was laughably simple. A carpenter ran up one of the gadgets in 5 minutes out of bits of spare wood. The base was a small triangle of plywood with a peephole at one angle and 2 nails stuck in the other corners. "You look through the peephole," Dan said, "and when the 2 towers on the dams are in line with the nails, you release your bomb. You'll find it'll drop in the right spot, but you'll have to stick right on the speed." Gibson shook his head in wonder. Workmen put 2 dummy towers on the dam across the neck of a Midland lake. The bomb aimers knocked up their own sights, and on his first try, one of them dropped 8 practice bombs with an average error of only 4 yards. But there was still the problem of height. Gibson tried repeatedly to see if practice made perfect, but it didn't. Time was getting short. Gibson got a call from Satterley. "They've finished the first 2 prototypes of the new bomb," Satterley said. "Fly down to Herne Bay tomorrow and watch the test drops. Take your bombing leader with you." That was April the 15th. Wallis met them, and next morning they drove out to a bare beach near Reculver. "I'm sorry to get you up so early," said the ever-courteous Wallis, "but the tide is up, and that's the right time. The idea is to drop the thing about 1/2 a mile short of those 2 white buoys, and if it works all right, it should bounce the rest of the way and go right between them. Out of the east came two specks which grew into Lancasters, heading low over the shallows towards the two buoys bobbing on the water. "The other one's the camera aircraft," Wallis said as they watched them. And as the noise of engines filled the air, Wallis was shouting above the roar, "He's high! He's too high!" The Lancaster swept up side by side, and a great black thing dropped slowly away under the nearer one. It hit and vanished in a sheet of spray that hissed up towards the plain. For a moment there was nothing but the spray, and then out of it the fragments came flying. Wallis stood there very still. "Broken," he said. "Too big and too heavy, and the case too light." He took a deep breath and looked at Gibson with a faint smile. "Don't worry," he said. "We've still got a lot of work to do, but it's going to be all right." Cochrane set the backroom boys to work on the problem of keeping the aircraft at exactly 150 feet. A couple of days later, Ben Lockspicer of the Ministry of Aircraft Production arrived at Grantham with an idea. It was absurd to think how simple it was, and how effective. "Put a spotlight under the nose," he said, "and another one under the belly, both pointing down and inwards, so that they converge at 150 feet. When the two spots come together on the water, there you are." Gibson cheerfully told the crews, and when they had finished, Spafford said casually, "I could have told you that. Last night, Terrier Terham and I went to see the Enser show, and when the girl was doing her striptease, there were these two spotlights shining on her, and the idea crossed my mind then, and I was going to tell you." Gibson just looked at him. Maudsley flew a Lancaster down to Farnborough, and they fitted two spotlights on it the same day. Coming back, he made test runs across the airfield, and it worked beautifully. Maudsley said it was easy to get the circles of light together and keep them there. They all tried it over Derwent Quarter, and could fly to within 2 feet of the prescribed height with wonderful consistency. Everyone got a tremendous kick out of it. That was a very major problem solved. Down at Weybridge, Wallis was still trying to strengthen the bomb. On April the 22nd, Wallis and Gibson, plus the usual gaggle of Air Ministry officials, watched as this first new model was dropped over Reculver. It hit and rose briefly from the water, and then again. Fragments flew off it, and it didn't work, or skip. The tormented scientist groaned in his anguish. He'd been getting very little sleep for weeks. 3 weeks now to the time of the raid, and if they couldn't make it then, it would have to be put off for another year, probably, in view of official skepticism, forever. Wallis became aware of Gibson beside him. "It's the first impact that does the damage," he said. "I'd allowed for the extra weight that quadruples the blow, but a 5-tonner drops just that much faster." Gibson said, "Well, you didn't miss by much." "Marginal, but enough," Wallis sighed. "A bit slower, a bit lower, say 60 feet, and I'd bet my life on it." A silence fell between the two, and Gibson could feel his scalp crawling a little. He had an unpleasant feeling that he was going to break the first rule of the service: never volunteer for anything. He said quietly, "You really think 60 feet would do it, sir?" Wallis said absently, "Yes, certainly. The initial impact would be so much less." Gibson said hesitantly, "Maybe we could have a crack at that, sir." Wallis said, "It's good of you to suggest it, Gibby, but I said my life, not yours. 60 feet against a defended target wouldn't give you much chance, would it?" Gibson was thinking of his 173 missions, and he still had a whole skin. Just one more to do. Did he have the guts to do it? Did he have the right to ask the others? He said, "Well, maybe we'd have a little more chance now than you realize, sir. I didn't have time to tell you before, but we've solved the height problem." Wallis looked at him in mild surprise, changing to excitement as Gibson explained about the fore and aft lights. At the end, all Wallis could say for a while was, "Oh, good heavens," in an astonished sort of way. The two stood in silence while Wallis creased his brow in thought. Gibson thought he could practically hear the computer mind ticking over. Wallis started spelling it out, talking half to himself. "Yes, you could alter the angle of the lights for 60 feet. I can calculate a new speed and range from target for bomb releases." He broke off and looked directly at Gibson. "You know, you and your chaps would not only have to fly much lower into the defences, you'd have to delay the drop until you were much nearer the dams. Isn't that too risky?" "No, sir," Gibson lied. "They won't be expecting us," he added. Wallis said, his voice a little unsteady with emotion, "Thanks, Gibby. And to all your boys. I don't know what else to say. I wish it were my life in the balance, not yours." Gibson said with enforced cheerfulness, "Oh, I wouldn't worry too much about it, sir. They won't be expecting us at 60 feet at night. If the bomb works at 60 feet, we'll give it a go." Wallis seemed to find it a little difficult to speak for a moment. Then he said cautiously, "Well, we're not there yet. First, we have to make sure. Test another strengthened bomb from 60 feet. We haven't got much time." They turned towards the waiting cars. Wallis went back to Weybridge, and Gibson arrived a few hours later at Scampton. He called the pilots, bomb aimers, and navigators together and told them that the arrival of the modified Lancasters might be delayed a day or two, as technicians from Farnborough and Adborough would be adjusting the height lights to converge at 60 feet. That was the new height for dropping the bomb. He said it calmly, without histrionics, and there was hardly even a gasp. As one of them said years later, "You have to be breathing to gasp." On April the 29th, Wallis finished another strengthened bomb and had it flown to Reculver for the drop. Rain was pouring down, but Wallis, out on the dunes, didn't even notice it as he watched the Lancaster charging out of the east towards the markers. The pilot had her tucked down neatly to 60 feet at just under 250 indicated airspeed, squinting through the rain squalls to hold his height and see the markers. The bomb fell slowly, hit cleanly, and worked. From the first creamy splash of impact, it soared up and away, splashed down again without any distortion a couple of 100 yards farther on, and then on and on till she slid through the marker buoys. At midnight on May the 13th, a convoy of covered lorries rolled round the perimeter track to the bomb dump at Scampton. A cordon of guards gathered round, and the bombs were trolleyed into the dump and hidden under tarpaulins. Gibson drove off to see Satterley and planned the routes for the raid, taking with him Group Captain Pickard, of F for Freddy fame, because he was a gen man on German flak positions, and on a low-level raid there's nothing more important than plotting a track between the known flak. They spread their maps out on the floor and carefully penciled in 2 separate tracks that wound in and out of the red blotches of the known flak. The first one sneaked in between Walcheren and Schuvin, cut across Holland, delicately threaded between the night fighter aerodromes at Gilse Region and Eindhoven, snaked around the crimson blotches of the Ruhr, and south to the Mohne. The second one cut in up north over Vlieland, came in over the flak-free Zuider Zee, and joined Route 1 northwest of Wesel. The attack would be in 3 waves, Gibson leading 9 aircraft on the southern route, Munro leading others on the northern, and 5 aircraft taking off a couple of hours later to act as a reserve. On the morning of May the 15th, you could clearly sense the tension, more so when word spread that the AOC had arrived. Cochrane saw Gibson and Whitworth alone. and was brief and businesslike. "If the weather's right, you go tomorrow night. Start briefing your crews this afternoon and see that your security is foolproof." After lunch, a little aeroplane landed, and Wallis and Mutt Summers climbed out. 10 minutes later, they were with Gibson and Whitworth, with a guard on the door. Gibson couldn't take his beloved nigger on the raid, but he couldn't bear to leave him out altogether, so he gave them the greatest honor he could think of. When, or if, the Mohne Dam was breached, he would radio back the one code word, "nigger." In the hangars, messes and barracks, the tannoy came loudly and dramatically to life. "All pilots, navigators and bomb aimers of 617 report to the briefing room immediately." At 3 o'clock, there were some 60 of them in the briefing room on the upper floor of the grey and black camouflage station headquarters. They sat silently on the benches, eyeing the familiar maps, aircraft identification and air-sea rescue posters on the walls, waiting. Whitworth, Gibson and Wallis filed down the centre to the dais, and Whitworth nodded to Gibson. "Go ahead, Guy." The room was still. Gibson faced them, feet braced apart, his eyes bright. He cleared his throat and said, "You're going to have a chance to clobber the Hun harder than a small force has ever done before. Very soon, we're going to attack the major dams in western Germany." A rustle and murmuring broke the silence, and some deep breaths. Gibson turned to the map and pointed with his ruler. "Here they are," he said. "Here's the Mohne, here's the Eder, and here's the Sorpe. As you can see, they're all just east of the Ruhr." He went on to explain the tactics, told each crew what wave they would be on and what dam they were to attack. Wallis took over and described the dams and what the bombs were supposed to do, how success would cripple the Ruhr steel industry, how other factories would be affected and bridges and roads washed away. Gibson stood up. "Any questions?" he said. Maltby got up. "What are the dam's defences like, sir?" "We've had extensive photo recce over them for some time now," Gibson said, "and the defences seem to be confined to light flak. You'll be shown their position." Someone asked if there were any nets on the lake, and Gibson described the torpedo booms in front of the dam walls. Lego wanted to know how effective they would be against the bomb, and Gibson, with a sidelong glance at Wallis and a fierce grin, said, "Not a sausage." He crossed the room to a couple of trestle tables where 3 dust covers were hiding something, pulled the covers off, and there were the models of the dams. "All of you come over and have a look at these," he commanded, and there was a scraping of chairs as 60 young men got up and crowded around. "Look at these till your eyes stick out, and you've got every detail photographed on your minds. Then buzz off and get some grub." As they studied the models intently, Gibson said, "And one more thing. Keep your mouths shut, not even a whisper to your own crews. They'll find out tomorrow. If there's one slip, and the Hun gets an inkling, you won't be coming back tomorrow night." That evening, as Gibson was going along to his room, Charles Whitworth approached him with a worried look on his face. "Guy," he said, "I'm awfully sorry, but Nigger's just been run over by a car outside the camp. He was killed instantaneously." Gibson sat a long time in his bed, looking at the scratch marks that Nigger used to make on his door. Nigger and he had been together since before the war. It seemed to be an omen. The morning of May the 16th was sunny. It was just after 9 a.m. that Gibson bounced into his office and told Humphreys to draw up the flying program. "Training, sir?" More of a statement than a question. "No, well, That is, yes, to everyone else. And as Humphreys looked bewildered, he said quietly, "We're going to war tonight, but I don't want the world to know. Mark the list, night flying program, and don't mention the words battle order." Watson, the armament chief, was dashing around busily, and Trevor Roper was seeing that all guns were loaded with full tracer that shot out of the guns at night like angry meteors, and to people on the receiving end looked like cannon shells. Towards noon, a mosquito touched down with the last photos of the dams. The water in the Mohne was 4 feet from the top. After lunch, Gremlin Matthews, meteorological officer at Grantham, spoke to all the other Group Met officers on a locked circuit of trunk lines for half an hour. Such conferences rarely found agreement, but this time they did. The lively, bespectacled figure of the Gremlin walked into Cochrane's office as soon as he'd put the receiver down. "It's all right for tonight, sir." He gave a definite prediction of clear weather over Germany. Cochrane went out to his car and drove off towards Scampton. The tannoy sounded about 4 o'clock, ordering all 617 crews to the briefing room, and soon there were 133 hushed young men sitting on the benches. 2 crews were out because of the illness. Gibson repeated what he had told the others the previous day, and Wallis, in his earnest, slightly pedantic way, told them about the dams and what their destruction would do. Cochrane finished with a short, crisp talk. The final lineup was Formation 1, 9 aircraft in 3 waves, taking off with 10 minutes between waves. Gibson, Hopgood, Martin, Young, Astle, Maltby, Maudsley, Knight, Shannon. They were to attack the Mohne, and after the Mohne was breached, those who had not bombed would go on to the Eder. Formation 2. 1 wave in loose formation. McCarthy, Byers, Barlow, Rice, Munro. They were to attack the Sorpe, crossing the coast by the northern route as a diversion to split the German defences. Formation 3. Townsend, Brown, Anderson, Otley, Burpee. They would take off later as the mobile reserve. Supper in the mess was quiet, the calm before the storm. No one said much. The non-flying people thought it was to be a training flight, but the crews, who knew it was going to be business, probably sticky, couldn't say so, and there was a faint atmosphere of strain. After supper, they drifted down to their hangars in 2s and 3s and started to change. It was not 8 o'clock yet. Still an hour to take off, and still broad daylight. They drifted over to the grass by the apron and lay in the sun, smoking and talking quietly. Gibson found himself wishing to God it were time to go, and knew that they were all wishing the same. At 10 to 9, he said clearly, "Well, chaps, my watch says time to go." Bodies stirred on the grass with elaborate casualness, tossed their parachutes into the flight trucks, climbed in after them, and the trucks moved off round the perimeter track to the hard standings. At exactly 10 past 9, a red Very light curled up from Gibson's aircraft, the signal for McCarthy's 5 aircraft to start. The northern route was longer, and they were taking off 10 minutes early. Seconds later, there was a spurt of blue smoke behind Munro's aircraft as his port inner engine started. One by one, the engines came to life. Jeff Rice's engines were turning, then Barlow's, then Byers. At precisely 9:25, Gibson, in G for George, Martin, in P for Popsy, and Hopgood, in M for Mother, punched the buttons of the booster coils, and the wisps of blue smoke spurted as the engines whined and spun explosively. G for George waddled forward with the shapeless bulk under its belly, like a pregnant duck, Gibson had said, taxied to the south fence, swung its long snout to the north and waited, engines turning quietly. P for Popsy turned slowly in on the left, and M for Mother on the right. Gibson rattled out the monotonous orders of his final check. "Flaps 30. Pulford, the engineer, pumped down 30 degrees of flap and repeated, "Flaps 30. Radiators open, radiators open. Throttles firm." Pulford checked the nut on the throttle quadrant. "Throttles firm." "Prepare to take off," Gibson said, and checked through to all the crew on the intercom. "Okay, rear gunner?" "Okay." Then all the others. He leaned forward with his thumb up, looking to left and then to right, and Martin and Hopwood raised their thumbs back. Pulford closed his hand over the 4 throttles and pushed till the engines deepened their note. Then Gibson flicked his brakes off. There was the hiss of compressed air, and they were rolling, all 3 of them, engineers sliding the throttles right forward. The blare of 12 engines slammed over the field and echoed in the hangar. The tails slowly came up as they picked up speed, ungainly with nearly 5 tons of bomb and over 5 tons of petrol each. Gibson held her down for a long time, and the ASI was flicking on 110 miles per hour before he tightened back on the wheel and let her come unstuck after a long, slow bounce. At 200 feet, they turned slowly on course, with the sun low behind. At 9:47, Dingy Young led Astle and Maltby off. 8 minutes after that, Maudsley, Shannon, and Knight were in the air. The final 5, the reserve aircraft, did not take off till 2 hours later. By the time they arrived in the target area, Gibson, if still alive, would know where to send them. In the ops room at 5 Group HQ at Grantham, Cochrane was walking Barnes Wallis up and down, trying to comfort him. Wallis was like an expectant father, fidgety and jittery, and Cochrane was talking of anything but the bomb, trying to get Wallis's mind off it. But Wallis could think of nothing else. A black Bentley rushed up the gravel drive outside, pulled up by the door, and the sentries snapped rigidly to attention as Harris himself jumped briskly out. He came into the ops room. "How's it going, Cocky?" "All right so far, sir," Cochrane said. "Nothing to report yet." They walked up and down the long room between the wall where the aircraft blackboards were and the long desk that ran down the other side where men were sitting. Satterley was there, the gremlin, the intelligence man, and Dunn, chief signals officer, sitting by a telephone plugged into the radio in the signals cabin outside. He would get all the Morse from the aircraft there. It was too far for low-flying planes to get through by ordinary speech. Harris and Cochrane talked quietly, and Wallis was walking miserably with them but not talking, breaking away every now and then to look at the big operations map on the end wall. The track lines had been penciled in, and he was counting off the miles they should be traveling. It was 10:35 when Cochrane looked at his watch and said, "They ought to be coming up to the Dutch coast now." The sun had gone and the moon was inching higher into the dusk, lighting a road ahead across the water. Outside the dancing road, the water was hardly visible, a dark mass with a couple of little flecks. Terham said, "5 minutes to the Dutch coast," and the crew snapped out of the wordless lull of the past half hour. Martin and Hopgood eased their aircraft forward till the black snouts nosed alongside Gibson and veered out to make a wider target, their engines snarling thinly in gusts above the monotonous roar in G for George. Flying so low just off the water, they seemed to be sliding very fast along the moon path towards the waiting flak. Spafford said, "There's the coast." There was a black line lying dim and low on the water, and then from a couple of miles out on the port side, a chain of glowing little balls was climbing into the sky. "Flagship," said Martin laconically. The shells were a way off and he ignored them. The sparkling moon path ended abruptly. They tore across the white line of surf and were over enemy territory. "New course 105 magnetic," Terham called, and the 3 aircraft swung gently to the left as they started the game of threading their way through the flak. The The northern wave made landfall about the same time, sighting Vlieland and turning southeast to cut across the narrow part and down over the Zuider Zee. The dark spit was so narrow they would see the water again in about 30 seconds and have another 70 miles of comparatively safe water. But without warning, there were flashes below, and up came the fiery little balls. Munro felt the shock as they hit the aircraft, and then they were past and over the water again. Munro called on the intercom to see if the crew were all right, but the earphones were dead. He flew on several miles, trying to fool himself they could still carry on, but it was no good, and he knew it. Without radio, he could not direct his crew or get bombing instructions. Swearing, he turned for home. Inside the Zuider, the water was dark and quite flat, treacherously deceptive for judging height. Jeff Rice slipped down a little to level at 60 feet by his belly lights, but the lights were not working properly and lured him lower as he tried to get a fix. A hammer seemed to hit the aircraft like a boat, and there was a tearing roar above the engines. Rice dragged her off the water, but the belly was torn out of her, and the bomb had gone with it. The gutted fuselage had scooped up a couple of tons of water. It was pouring out of her, and the rear gunner was nearly drowning in his turret. Marvelously, she still flew, but was dropping back, and when they found the bomb was gone, Rice turned her heavily back towards England. No one knows exactly how soon it was that the flak came curling up at them again, but there is a report that as Barlow's aircraft hit the ground, the bomb went off with a blinding flash. It lit up the countryside like a rising sun for 10 seconds before it died and left nothing. It was either then or soon after that Byers and his crew died too. Nothing more was heard from him. Only McCarthy was left of the Sorper team. Over Holland, Gibson, Martin and Hopgood were down as low as 40 feet, playing hide-and-seek with the ground, the bomb-aimers calling terse warnings as houses and trees loomed up, and the aircraft skimmed over them. 4 miles to port, they saw the flare path of Gilserichen, German night fighter field, and a few miles farther on they passed just to the left of the night fighter aerodrome at Eindhoven. They could expect night fighters now. The ops rooms for miles around must be buzzing. Martin and Hopwood closed in on each side of Gibson for mutual protection. Just past Eindhoven, Gibson led them in a gentle turn to the northeast on the new course that would take them round the bristling guns of the Ruhr. A few miles back, the others were on course too. Dingy Young pinpointed over the canal at Roosendaal and turned delicately to take them between the fighter fields. But Bill Astle didn't seem sure that this was the exact turning point. He bore off a little to the south for a minute and then turned back, but had fallen half a mile behind and was a fraction off track. They didn't see him again, and it must have been quite soon after that that the flak, or fighter, whatever it was, got him. The leading three slid across the border into Germany and saw no light or movement anywhere, only darkness filled with the beat of engines. Terham thought they were south of track, so they edged to the north, a little nervily, because this was the treacherous leg. They were coming up to the Rhine to sneak between the guns of Hulst and the Ruhr. Just short of the river, some 12 light flak guns opened up without warning. The aircraft gunners squirted back at the roots of the tracer, and then they were out of range. No one badly hit. The Rhine was rushing at them, and up from a barge spat a thin line of tracer, but they were past before the bullets found them. 2 minutes later, more guns opened up, and this time 3 searchlights lit on Gibson. Foxley and Deering were shooting at the searchlights. One of them popped out, but the 2 others held, and the air was full of tracer. The rear gunners came into action. The searchlights switched to Martin, blinding him, and Gibson could read the big P on the side of the Lancaster. Every gun was firing, the aircraft juddering with the recoil, and then they were through with throttles wide. Ahead, and just to the left, another searchlight sprang into life and caught Gibson. Foxley was firing instantly, holding his triggers in a long burst, his tracer whipping into the light. It flicked out, and as they went over in the dying glow, they saw the gunners scattering. Tammy Simpson opened up from the rear turret till they were well out of range. You can't take prisoners in an aircraft. Gibson swung them north around Ham. Terham said, "New course, skipper, 165 magnetic." And then they were hugging ground on the last leg, slicing between Soest and Velde. Now the moon was high enough to light the ground, and ahead loomed the dark hills that cradled the water. They climbed to the ridge that rimmed the horizon, crossed into the valley, and down below lay the flat sheet of Mohne Lake. It was like looking down on the model, the same saucer of water, the same dim fields, and across the neck of the lake, the squat rampart hugging the water, crowned by the towers. In the half-light it looked like a battleship, but more impregnable. Reinforced concrete 100 feet thick. The dam came suddenly to life, prickling with sharp flashes, and the lines of angry red meteors were streaming into the sky and moving about blindly as the gunners hosed the area. The pilots swung the aircraft away and headed in wide circles around the lake, keeping out of range and waiting for the others. There seemed to be about 10 guns, some in the fields on each side of the lake near the dam, and some in the towers themselves. Gibson started calling the other aircraft, and one by one they reported, except Astle. He called Astle again at the end, but Astle had been dead for an hour. After a while, Gibson gave up and said soberly over the intercom, "Well, boys, I suppose we'd better start the ball rolling." It was the end of the waiting and the start of action, when thought is submerged. He flicked his transmitter switch. "Hello, all aircraft. I'm going into attack. Stand by to come in on your order when I tell you." He turned wide, hugging the hills at the eastern end of the lake. Pulford had eased the throttles on, and she was roaring harshly, picking up speed and quivering, the nose slowly coming round, till 3 miles ahead they saw the towers and the rampart of the dam, and in between, the flat, dark water. Spafford said, "This is wizard. I can see everything." They came out of the hills and slammed across the water, touching 240 now, and Gibson rattled off the last orders. Terham flicked the belly lights on and, peering down from the blister, started droning, "Down, down, down, up a bit. Steady, steady." The lights were touching each other. G for George was exactly at 60 feet, and the flak gunners had seen the lights. The streams of glowing shells were swiveling and lowering, and then the shells were whipping towards them, seeming to move slowly at first like all flak, and then rushing madly at their eyes as the aircraft plunged into them. Gibson said tersely, "Bomb on." Spafford flicked the switch and heard the whine of the electric motor starting back in the fuselage. He could hear it winding up speed, and a vibration grew through the aircraft as the black barrel underneath stirred out of its inertia and started revolving backwards, faster and faster. Gibson held her steady, pointing between the towers. Terham was watching out of the blister. Pulford had a hand on the throttles. Spafford held the plywood sight to his eye, and the towers were closing in on the nails. There was a sudden snarling clatter up in the nose. Deering had opened up, his tracer spitting at the towers. The dam was a rushing giant, darkness split with flashes. The cockpit stank of cordite, and thought was nothing but a cold alarm shouting, "In another minute we shall all be dead." And then Spafford screamed, "Bomb gone!" loud and sharp, and they rocketed over the dam between the towers. A red very light soared up as Hutchison pulled the trigger to let the others know. And then the deeper, snarling chatter as Trevor Roper opened up on the towers from the rear. It was over, and memory was confusion as they corkscrewed down the valley, hugging the dark earth sightless to the flak. They were out of range, and Gibson lifted her out of the hills, turning steeply, and looked back. The black water between the towers suddenly rose and split, and a huge white core erupted through the middle and climbed towards the sky. The lake was writhing, and as the white column reached its peak and hung 1,000 feet high like a ghost against the moon, the heavy explosion reached the aircraft. They looked in awe as they flew back to one side and saw sheets of water spilling over the dam, and thought for a wild moment it had burst. The fury of the water passed, and the dam was still there, the white column slowly dying. Round the lake they flew while Hutchison tapped out in code to base. In a few minutes, Gibson thought the lake was calm enough for the next bomb and called, "Hello, M for Mother. You may attack now. Good luck." "Okay, leader. Attacking now." Hopgood was lost in the darkness over the hills at the end of the lake while the others waited. They saw his belly lights flick on, and the two little yellow pools sliding over the water, closing and joining as he found his height. He was straight and level on his run. The flak saw him, and the venomous fireflies were darting at him. He plunged on. The gap was closing fast when the shells found him, and someone said, "Hell! He's been hit!" A red glow was blossoming around the inner port wing tank, and then a long ribbon of flame trailed behind M for Mother. The bomb aimer must have been hit, because the bomb overshot the parapet onto the powerhouse below. M for Mother was past the dam, nose up, straining for height so that the crew could bail out, when the tanks blew up with an orange flare. A wing ripped away, and the bomber spun to the ground in burning, bouncing pieces. The bomb went off near the powerhouse like a brilliant sun. It was all over in seconds. A voice said over the RT, "Poor old Hoppy." Gibson called up, "Hello, Peep Popsy. Are you ready?" "Okay, leader. Going in." Gibson said, "I'll fly across the dam as you make your run and try and draw the flak off you." "Okay. Thanks, leader." Martin was turning in from the hills, and Gibson headed across the lake, parallel to the dam and just out of effective range of the guns. As Martin's spotlights merged and sped across the water, Gibson backtracked, and Deering and Trevor Roper opened up. 6 lines of tracer converged on the towers, drawing their attention so that for some seconds most of the guns did not notice Martin rocketing over the water. He held his height, and Whittaker had the speed right. They were tracking straight for the middle of the dam between the moon-bathed towers when the gunners spotted them, and threw a curtain of fire between the towers, spreading like a fan so that they would fly through it. Martin drove straight ahead. A sharp "Bomb gone!" from Bob Hay, and in the same instant a shudder as 2 shells smacked into the starboard wing, one of them exploding in the inner petrol tank. A split second of flashes as they shot through the barrage. Tammy Simpson opened up from the rear turret. Chambers shot the very light, and they were down the valley. Whittaker was looking fearfully at the hole in the starboard wing, but no fire was coming. He suddenly realized why and nudged Martin, yelling in his ear, "Thank Christ! The bloody starboard tank was empty!" Martin shouted, "Bomb gone, leader!" "Okay, Popsy. Let me know when you're out of the flak." "Hello, A-Apple. Are you ready?" "Okay, leader." "Right, go ahead. Let me know when you're in position and I'll draw the flak for you." Martin called again. "P. Popsy, clear now, leader." "Okay, are you hit?" "Yeah, starboard wing, but we're all right. We can make it." The lake suddenly boiled again by the dam and spewed out the great white column that climbed again to 1,000 feet. More water was cascading over the dam, but it cleared soon, and the dam was still there. Dinghy Young was on the air again. "Hey, Apple, making bombing run." Gibson headed back over the lake where his gunners could play with fire, and this time Martin did the same. As Young came plunging across the lake, Gibson and Martin came in on each side, higher up, and the flak didn't know where to shoot. Young swept past the dam and reported he was all right. The great explosion was up against the dam wall again, beautifully accurate. But the dam was still there, and again Gibson waited till the plume of spray had cleared and the water was calm. He called Maltby, and in a few moments the mountain of water erupted skyward again under the dam wall. The spray from the explosion was misting up the whole valley now, and it was hard to see what was happening by the dam. Gibson called Shannon to make his attack, and the words were barely out of his mouth when a sharp voice filled his earphones. "Hell, he's gone! Look at it, for Christ's sake!" Wheeling round the valley side, Martin had seen the concrete face abruptly split and crumble under the weight of water. Gibson swung in close and was staggered. A ragged hole 100 yards across and 100 feet deep split the dam, and the lake was pouring out of it. 134 million tons of water crashing into the valley in a jet 200 feet long, smooth on top, foaming at the sides where it tore the rough edges of the breach, and boiling over the scarred earth where the powerhouse had been. In the moon glow, they watched a wall of water rolling down the valley, 25 feet high, moving 20 feet a second. The awed silence was broken by a babble of intercom chatter as they went mad with excitement. The only man not looking being Hutchison, sitting at his keyboard, tapping out the word "nigger." Soon the hissing steam and spray blurred the valley. Gibson called Martin and Maltby to set course for home, and told Young, Shannon, Maudsley and Knight to follow him east to the Eder. 3 kilometers down the valley from the Mohne lay the sleeping village of Himmelpforten, which means Gates of Heaven. The explosion had wakened the village priest, Father Berkenkopf, and he guessed instantly what was happening. He'd been afraid of it for 3 years. He ran to his small stone church, Porta Coeli, which also means Gate of Heaven in Latin, and began tugging grimly on the bell rope, the signal he had arranged with his villagers. It's not certain how many were warned in time. In the darkness, the clanging of the bell rolled ominously round the valley, and then it was muffled in the thunder moving nearer. Berkenkopf must have heard it and known what it meant, but it seems that he was still pulling at the bell when the flood crushed the church and the village of the Gates of Heaven and rolled them down the valley. It went for many miles and took more villages, a tumbling maelstrom of water and splintered houses, beds and frying pans, the chalice from Porta Coeli and the bell, the bodies of cattle and horses, pigs and dogs, and the bodies of Father Berkenkopf and other human beings. War, as someone said, is a great leveler, but he didn't mean it quite as literally or as bitterly as this. The attack on the Eder Dam was even more fantastic than the Mohne. The breach in the dam was as big, and there were over 200 million tons of water pouring through. The Eder Valley was steeper, and they watched speechlessly as the flood foamed and tossed down the valley, lengthening like a snake. It must have been rolling at 30 feet a second. They saw a car in front, racing to get clear. Only the lights they saw, like 2 frightened eyes spearing the dark, and the car wasn't fast enough. The foam crawled up on it, the headlights turned opalescent green as the water rolled over, and suddenly they flicked out. Hutchison was tapping dinghy in Morse. That was the code to say that the Eder was destroyed. When he'd finished, Gibson called, "Okay, all aircraft, let's go home." The sound of their engines died over the hills as they flew west to fight their way back. McCarthy had fought a lone way through to the Sorpe. The valleys were full of mist, so it was a long time before he pinpointed himself over the lake, dimly seeing through the haze a shape he recognized from the model. He tried a dummy run and found, as the others found before at the Eder, that there was a hill at each end, so that he would have to dive steeply, find his aiming point quickly, and pull up in a hurry. He tried twice more, but was not satisfied, and came in a third time, plunging through the mist, trying to see through the suffused moonlight. Johnson picked up the aiming point, and seconds later yelled, "Bomb gone!" And they were climbing up over the far hills when the bomb exploded by the dam wall. McCarthy dived back over the dam, and they saw that the crest had crumbled for 50 yards. As they turned on course for England, Eaton tapped out the code word that told of their successful drop. Maltby was first back, landing in the dawn and finding the whole station had been waiting up since dusk. Harris, Cochrane and Wallis met him at the hard standing, and he told them what he'd seen. One by one the others landed, and were driven to the ops room, where Harris, Cochrane and Wallis listened intently. Gibson came in, his hair pressed flat from 8 hours under his helmet. "It was a wizard party, sir," he said. "Went like a bomb, but we couldn't quieten some of the flak. I'm afraid some of the boys got the hammer. Don't know how many yet. Hopgood and Maudsley for certain." They had bacon and egg and stood around the bar with pints, drinking and waiting for the others. It was an hour since the last aircraft had landed. Shannon and Dingy Young had ditched. And someone said, "Well, is the old soak going to paddle back again? That's the third time he's done it. He'll do it once too often." Young had done it once too often. He was not in his dinghy this time. Wallis was asking anxiously, "Where are they? Where are all the others?" Summers said, "Oh, they'll be along. Give them time. They probably landed somewhere else." But after a while, it was impossible to cover up any longer, and Wallis knew they were all standing round, getting drunk, for the ones who were not coming back. Except himself. He didn't drink. Martin made him take a half pint, but he only held it and stood there, blinking back the tears. "Oh, if only I'd known," he said. "I'd never have started this." Gibson left the party early, but not for bed. He went over to the hangar to give Humphreys and Chiefy Powell a hand with the casualty telegrams to the next of kin. 56 beardless men out of 133 were missing, and only 3 had got out by parachute at a perilously low height to spend the rest of the war miserably in prison camp. In the morning, 617 Squadron went on leave. 3 days for the ground crews, 7 days for the air crew survivors, except Gibson, who stayed on 2 days to write to the mothers of the dead. He refused to let Heveron type the usual form letter, but wrote them all out in his own hand, different ones each time, 56 of them. In London and in their homes, the crews found they were famous. A Recce Mosquito arrived back from over Germany with the first pictures of the damage, and they were breathtaking. The Mohne and Eder lakes were empty, and 330 million tons of water were spreading like a cancer through the western Ruhr valleys, the bones of towns and villages showing lifeless in the wilderness. For 50 miles from the Mohne and 50 miles from the Eder, coal mines were flooded and factories collapsed. At Fritzlar, one of Hitler's largest military aerodromes was underwater. The aircraft, the landing ground, hangars, barracks, and bomb dump. Roads, railways, and bridges had disappeared. The Unterneustadt industrial suburb of Kassel, 40 miles from the Eder, was under water, and the flood ran miles on down the Fulda Valley. Canal banks were washed away, power stations had disappeared, and the Ruhr foundries were without water for making steel. The communications system feeding raw materials to the Ruhr and taking away the finished weapons was completely disrupted. In the small town of Neheim alone, 2,000 men, including 1,250 soldiers, were diverted to repair damage. Another 2,000 men were trying to repair the dams. And in the months ahead, in the Battle of the Ruhr, there was not enough water to put the fires out. 125 factories were either destroyed or badly damaged, nearly 3,000 hectares of arable land was ruined, 25 bridges had vanished, and 21 more were badly damaged. For 617 Squadron, the famous Dams raid was only a beginning. They went on to fresh exploits and greater glory. They evolved a new form of precision bombing which enabled a specific military target to be hit accurately and destroyed. They became a special duties squadron and took part in the famous raid on Tromsø Fjord in Norway, in which the German battleship Tirpitz was sunk, and in raids on the German U-boat pens at Brest, Hamburg and Fage, near Bremen. At the end of the war against Germany, they were detailed to go to Okinawa as the RAF's contribution to the strategic bombing of Japan. They were all set to go when the two bombs, so much deadlier than anything 617 Squadron would have believed possible, fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. All that is left of the old days now are the squadron number and the tradition. The men who won over 150 decorations and made the tradition are scattered, and many of them are dead. Gibson is dead. He went to America, and when he came back he toyed with the idea of going into politics, but decided to stay in the RAF. On July the 11th, 1944, he was disconsolately flying a desk when Mickey Martin flew over in a Mosquito, and Gibson eyed the little plane wistfully. Martin took him up for a couple of circuits, and then Gibson flew it himself. He said when he landed, "I'm fed up with sitting on my tail. I'm going back on ops." He worried his seniors till they reluctantly agreed. And a few weeks later, Gibson took off in a Mosquito for one last raid to act as master bomber of 5 Group on a factory at Reit, near the Ruhr. He guided the bombing, and when it was over, they heard his voice on the RT saying, "Okay, chaps, that's fine. Now beat it home." No one knows exactly what happened after that. They think that Gibson may have been hit by flak. He crashed into a low hill in Holland, 60 miles from Reit, on the way home, and the Dutch buried him there. Martin distinguished himself as a night fighter pilot, winning another bar to his DFC. After the war, he shepherded the squadron of vampires in the first jet flights across the Atlantic. Then he broke the London, Cape Town and return record in a Mosquito. At Weybridge, Wallis stayed the white-haired patriarch, pink-faced, gentle, and abstracted as ever. He remained an old-fashioned scientist with new-fangled ideas, forever browsing over the same old drawing board, still getting outlandish ideas which unaccountably worked. Strange about Wallis. He designed and constructed the only successful British airship during the 30s. Then he designed the Wellesley bomber, which captured the world's long-distance flight record. Then he designed the Wellington bomber, which was the early mainstay of the RAF Bomber Command, and was still operational into the 50s. But the only official recognition he ever received was the CBE after the Dams raid. Then, early in 1969, some 26 years too late, the British government belatedly offered him a knighthood. He accepted, without much feeling one way or the other. After the war, his friends urged him to claim a reward for his wartime inventions, but he said that if he did, he would never touch such money for himself. When asked why, he referred to a story in the Bible about David, Samuel 2, chapter 23. It ends with the words, "Is not this the blood of the men that went in jeopardy of their lives?"